All right, so we've got our heads around the context of Titus, so now we're ready to dive into Titus chapter 1. And the principle we're going to talk about right now is this idea of structure. And the idea here is that every author inspired by God wrote in such a way that he wanted us to understand what he was saying. It's hopefully not too crazy a thought, but he actually wants us to understand his point. He wants us to get the gist of what he's saying. And so he writes in a way to be understood. So you can imagine that the picture to remember this is a bridge. So a bridge has different parts to it, right? There's footings, there's pylons, there's the main road across, right? And the purpose of this structure of the bridge is to get you from one side to the other, right? So the bridge has all these parts that come together to convey a purpose. And the same way, every piece of writing is the same. It has all these parts to it. You could divide up into parts, but you can see how those parts were put together intentionally to help us see the point the author is communicating. The author wants us to get the main point. He wants us to understand what he's saying. And so as we learn to identify the parts, that helps us see how they fit together to understand the main point. All right. Now, different genres can do this differently, and some of these things are similar across. So for example, in Psalms 42 and 43, which are kind of really one psalm, there's this repetition, "Why are you downcast, O my soul, and why so disturbed within me?" It happens 3 times. It kind of breaks up the psalm into 3 chunks, right? Sometimes, especially in narrative, you'll have maybe a change of scene. Welcome. You'll have a change of scene that will show kind of a new section, right? Sometimes maybe it's character dialogue will kind of show you how to identify parts to kind of a section, where you'll have, like, for example, in Genesis 15, you have God and Abraham talking. And so God says something, he makes a promise to Abraham. Abraham goes, "I don't know if I really believe you're going to come through on it." And he says, "Well, here's my promise to you," again, and then Abraham believes. And this happens twice that cycle. So you can kind of see the flow of the story as you identify that pattern in those pieces. Sometimes it might just be a change of theme or change of imagery, right? A lot of times in letters, what you'll have is transition words, right? So to identify the structure, you might look for transition words. What would be some good transition words you might look for to identify the author's kind of moving to like a new kind of subpoint, a new section of his argument? Therefore. That is a great one. Whenever you see a therefore, you need to ask, why is it there for? What is it there for, right? However. Yep. Because. Great. So there's others you could look for too. But you're getting the idea, right? You're looking for, he's talking about one thing, and then he says, but, and now he says another thing, right? He says one thing, so that, since then, because, right? So there's all these transition words, but what you're looking for is you're trying to trace the flow of the argument, and you're trying to sum it up in little chunks, and then you put it all together and say, what's the main point? Because what often happens when we get into a letter, right, is we just get lost in like all the little details of the letter, and we miss the flow of the argument. So if you can first say, all right, I'm going to read up this passage and divide into sections, right, with verse numbers, and say, okay, it seems like verses 1 to 3, Paul is saying this, and then he throws in a therefore, and now he says this, right? So I'm going to mark verses 1 to 3 as a section, verses 4, whatever. I'm just giving an example, right? And then what I find really helpful is to write a brief phrase summarizing that little section. So I say take Ephesians 2, just for example. You could say, okay, in verses 1 through 3, Paul writes about our lost state apart from Jesus. Verses 4 to 7, Paul writes about our new state now in Jesus, verses 8 through 10. Paul writes about our calling now in Jesus, or something like that, right? You could see, and these quick little summaries will help you be able to see the flow of the argument very quickly, right? Then you can write out a one-sentence main point of the author. Right, so now you take those little phrases you've got, and you're trying to put them together and say, how would I write out, if I was going to say, what's the author trying to communicate in this passage in one sentence, how would I say it? What's helpful about doing this is it forces you to really see if you can understand what's going on. Because you can always just ramble about things, but being able to say, Titus 1 is about this, that means you kind of actually have your head around it. And you might still have some lingering questions like, well, I'm not quite sure about this word or that word, but you're going to be able to get the gist of it. And this is really helpful because, right, like most mornings, if you're a busy person, like you don't have 4 hours to study Titus 1. You may have half an hour. And so you might not get every little thing, but if you do this, you're going to be able to zero in what's the main thing God wants to speak to us through Titus 1, and then be able to walk with some good application that day. Right. So I want us to practice this in kind of Titus chapter 1. All right. And what we're going to do is just do this. So let's have someone read Titus 1 out loud for us in just a second here. Then break up into your little groups. Pray. So we always want to pray. And then work on trying to divide up Titus chapter 1 into some sections with verse numbers. Write a brief phrase next to it, and then write out a one-sentence main point, okay? And what I'll do is I'll give you about 15 minutes to do that, and the time's intentionally short because I want you to see that you can get the gist of this in a short amount of time. Right? You can always go deeper, but hopefully you can kind of get the gist of this.